Thanks for tuning in to the World XP podcast. If you're enjoying the content, please drop us up, drop a like, and let us know your thoughts below in the comments. Also, please consider supporting our podcast via the link below. It really helps us out. Dom, welcome to the World XP podcast, man. How you doing?
Pretty good. Thanks for having me on.
For sure. So, real quick, before we get to the question from the previous guest, I want to give some context to those listening. Dom and I went to college together, and the genesis of this was kind of I had released a reel about kind of trusting the experts, right, in lieu of COVID and kind of the potential problems that might bring if people found out that they were lied to the next time that they really needed to trust people, would it go so well and that sort of thing. And the example that I brought up that not knowing anything about was environmental stuff, and that is Dom's area of expertise. So he shot me a message. And here we are. So why don't you do a quick intro, and then we'll get to the question from the last guest, and then we'll jump into it.
Sounds good. My name's Dominik Bonshire. I work with the school division in Virginia. My job is environmental technician. So anything related to the schools that I work at, such as asbestos management, stormwater management, mold remediation, those all fall under the purview of my department, and we're the ones responsible for managing those plans.
Fair enough. Okay, so the question from the previous guest, there's a quote kind of says, "You're only as good as your last performance." What was your last performance? And that can be, you can take that kind of metaphorically. It doesn't have to be exact.
What was my last performance? I had to do in my previous position with my employer, because I've had multiple in that department. I had to do a presentation in front of a panel that consisted of school board members, board of supervisor members for that county, about a food waste to compost program that the schools were running. It was a pretty successful program. It was just a pilot at the time. We chose 6 schools where all the waste going out of their cafeteria or out of their classrooms, anything food, we diverted that to a compost facility instead of just going straight to the landfill. And we saved, I think it was about 100 tons worth of food from going to the landfill and producing emissions. And that food ended up, through the pilot, being diverted, going back to the schools. If they wanted to build a garden or like a landscaping area, that would turn into compost for that as well. So it was a kind of a give and take kind of thing.
So your presentation went well, I take it.
Oh, it went. It was probably one of the best presentations I gave. I was so happy with how it went, and people were really interested in seeing these types of activities going on in the school. So it was pretty good to see.
I can imagine. Did you have to do a lot of presenting in college? I know various one of the things that about the college that we went to, you had to take several classes. I don't remember the exact number, but they were labeled speaking intensive. And obviously different majors had more of those than others. But did you have was that a new experience for you, or were you prepped from college?
Well, luckily I had taken some communication classes beforehand. So when I got to the later, like the upper level classes in the undergraduate degree, there were a lot of presentations that you have to give, research that you have to provide. So that was kind of natural when I moved into future positions. But yeah, I did do a lot of presentations at the time.
Yeah. One thing about that I remember before we jump into the meat of the conversation was I always hated presentations up until they were presentations on things that I had done them, like either done all the research on my GIS capstone presentation. I was not nervous at all for that one because I'd been working on it for months and months and months and months and months. And then like into my work life or even soccer stuff that you know the material on, I realized that I was not nervous at all for, and I realized that my nervousness was not necessarily a public speaking thing. It was more of like I didn't prepare for this at all.
Yeah.
And even if you don't prepare, if you know the material well, like if somebody asked me to give a presentation on my GIS capstone now, I probably still could without really preparing. Did you feel the same similarly?
Yeah, pretty much. I had to give the presentation twice to 2 different groups. For the previous one, I'm talking about the food compost project. But the first time that you give the presentation, at least in my mind, I was like, how can I connect all these different points that I have on a
Mm.
PowerPoint behind me. But how can I say that into words without just kind of reading off of the thing?
Yeah.
Um, but then the second time that I did it, I already had those connections already made. So that one went by. I cut down my part from like 5 minutes to like 3 minutes. And I was like, oh, wait, I still got some time that I have to kill. I don't really have anything else to say though. So this is an issue now. So, but it worked anyways.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so we were talking beforehand, about the kind of the impetus for your message to me, and I think that is probably a good way to start. So I obviously provided a little bit of context to those listening, but I think
Mhm.
yours is probably better because you're the one that reached out, and I was just like, sure, we could do that. That's works for me.
Mhm. So being in the environmental space and having kind of a background, especially in college, about sustainability, climate change, all those types of topics that are intertwined. I think there's a really big problem right now where people tend to get locked into bubbles, whether it's through the types of media that you consume, such as mainstream media versus alternative media, or social media, where you can get kind of caught in these little like epistemic bubbles where you can't really, well, the epistemic bubbles, I think you can kind of breach out of if you get enough sources around you. Or you can get locked into more like I can't remember what the term is. Like a
Echo
box.
echo
Echo
chamber.
chamber. Yeah, echo chamber. You can get locked into echo chambers where you pretty much discredit anything outside of the echo chamber. I think climate change and the conversation around that is definitely one of the ones that has that echo chamber problem where you see some people on one side who are very policy oriented, where all they want to do is we have this problem, climate change. What's a problem that climate change causes? Maybe energy transition. So you're like, okay, so how do we solve the energy transition problem? And they go on to policy related topics. Or you have the echo chamber problems where either you don't believe in climate change at all because, I don't know, it may be on the media that you consume, the sources that you get, or you could be somebody like I use the example of the Just Stop Oil group, where all they think to stop climate change is go throw ink on very famous paintings and art sculptures or go interrupt. I think I was watching the US Open tennis tournament
Hmm.
and a bunch of people had glued their feet to the concrete padding
Oh,
of
just
the stadium and it
unbelievable.
disrupted because they were yelling and then they disrupted the game and they had to pause and I was like, "Ah, man, I get
Yeah.
it, but I'm also just trying to watch the game. I'm trying to enjoy the
Yeah.
finals." And so it kind of takes away. I get the idea of why they do it, but at the same time, you are disrupting other people, probably won't make them listen to you any more than are they already aren't. But the problem around the conversation is that these groups don't at all talk. There's no discussion, there's no discourse between these groups. And I feel like anytime that there's a lack of knowledge or there's people that are genuinely curious about this, the topic, want to have the conversation, I think it should be pushed a little bit more.
Yeah, fair enough. For reference, the ink on the famous paintings, I think was it 2022. Some people in
Mm.
France went and threw soup on the Van Gogh and like glued themselves to the
Yeah.
paintings in the
Oh
Louvre
man.
in Paris.
Mm.
Um, yeah, I
It's
don't know. I don't know.
it
It's
doesn't help anything. I don't
no.
think that, yeah.
So this is kind of where my head is at. I listened to a
Mm.
few podcasts. Some Rogan had done something also in 2022 that I thought was quite interesting. He had a guy named Dr. Steve Koonin. I don't know if are you familiar with
Mhm.
okay.
I think I
So he
know the
had
episode you're talking about.
so he had him on, and then right afterwards he had a professor from Texas A&M, Andrew Dessler, on, and
Mm.
they kind of were are maybe they are on maybe not polar opposite viewpoints, but they gave the different perspectives, and he had them both on one right after the other. And so
Mm.
I listened to both in preparation for this, so I wouldn't sound like a complete moron. Um, but one of the things that I came away thinking from both episodes is yes, we have data from 100 years or whatever, but the scale of the Earth is so much greater than just the time frame that we have real data.
Mm.
Obviously, we have historical records, ice core samples, things of that nature. We know that an ice age happened 12,000 years ago ish or whatever the exact number is. We know some of these things that have happened throughout history. Um, and I would also say that we can probably predict some level of trending based on human emission. And so, um, that's not to say that the client science is all wrong, but some of the I'll say the more alarmist people, it's like, okay, the world is ending if we don't all switch to electric cars by 2035. I'm like, that doesn't really seem to hold water in my head because
Mhm.
of the longevity of the earth and all that stuff. But at the same time, the people that are like, well, we don't really know how much humans are having an impact, that also doesn't really seem to be the case. But I think maybe a more accurate, in my head anyways, right? Not having studied any of the studies or the science or taken any of the classes, but just done my own research. I know that
Mhm.
people think that that's weird now or whatever. But my kind of conclusion was we can probably have a pretty good idea of how much of an impact humans are having, but not an exact number. I think that number is not even, I don't know, do people have a number? Like, oh, humans have impacted blank percent of whatever. And then,
Mhm.
so there's all that. But then there's the what do we do about it? Because obviously, coal and natural gas and stuff is not the cleanest of energy sources. But you got people in third world countries that don't have the infrastructure to maybe build a nuclear power plant or something like that. And so, who
Mhm.
are we to tell them that they can't use coal when that would shut down a whole level of economic opportunity for them? And so, I don't know. That's just kind of where my head is at. There's a lot of different, there's the policy side, like you mentioned, and then there's the
Mhm.
actual science side. And the science side doesn't seem to be, it almost seems quasi-religious depending on what camp you're in. I don't know. Is that
Mhm.
a fair assessment? I don't know. So these are the kind of the conclusions that I've been coming to because I listened to Dessler say, well, Coonan is right about everything, but it's because he didn't say this one other part. And then Rogan would be like, well, what is that other part? And he'd be like, well, we're not really sure about that. And I'm like, okay, well,
Mhm.
you can't come argue that if you don't even have the thing. And then Coonan on the other side, like I get the argument that Dessler is making where Coonan's a defense lawyer for carbon dioxide, but it's like,
Mhm.
yeah, it's like me as somebody who hasn't studied any of this, like neither of them was like fully convincing.
Mhm. I get what you mean. When it comes to climate science, we have data that goes back hundreds of thousands of years. The problem where a lot of people get tripped up, and I guess, and this is for a good reason, I think, is the climate projections, which can
Hmm.
vary widely. One of the things that's been talked about recently when it comes to
Real quick,
oh
you
yeah,
said we have data from hundreds of thousands. How do we get the data?
those would be like ice cores from like Antarctica in places that have been covered in ice for a long time, glacial areas, really.
So real quickly, I guess for those listening, because I don't know how does that work?
Mhm. So we have a lot of camps in Antarctica, and a lot of them are international camps, which is pretty good. So that means we have a wide variety of like states that are basically involved in the science gathering. They'll drill thousands of meters down into the ice, and then they have a device that basically go like corkscrews down, and then they can insert like a tube, get the next sample of ice, and then bring it to the surface. And then they look at the lengths of the ice cores, and then they can take because there's little bubbles, like there's air bubbles trapped inside the ice cores from thousands of years ago, and then they can take samples from those and they can see, oh, what was the atmospheric composition at that point, however deep they went.
And that tells them enough to be able to make kind of accurate, it wouldn't be predictions, but
Like the
uh
projections.
projections of what things were like at that time
I
ish.
think that it does vary depending on where you are. I think the problem with the problem with the ice core specifically is it's usually just atmospheric composition, from what I
Hmm.
understand. Um, you don't really get, I guess, there's a lot of different, how do I say this? I'm trying to connect like three different things here.
Yeah.
Uh, when we think about atmospheric composition, millions of years ago, we had a very high CO2 level, like carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere. And there were plants and animals that were adapted to that level of CO2. Um, they were much larger animals than we have right now on the earth. Um, but uh, the problem with the CO2 in the atmosphere, the levels, so since the Industrial Revolution, we've pretty much doubled the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. I think it went up from about 200 parts per million to about 420, I think was the higher estimates right now, 420 parts per million. And while the Earth can survive those types of changes, because I think you could guess like I'll spitball a number like 20 million years ago, the CO2 could have been 1,000 parts per million or even higher than that. So we're much lower right now than we were, the Earth was back then. Um, the problem with looking at the ice cores, seeing the CO2 levels, and then going, well, maybe the CO2 wasn't that high. It's not that high. When we think about, and this is where environmental, my job comes into play a little bit. We look at CO2 in classrooms. Um, I can get a reading of 1,000 parts per million of carbon dioxide in a classroom of children, uh, and that would be a little bit high. But that's also because it's an enclosed area. There's a lot of people breathing. That's almost the norm. So when we think about when people are alarmed about 1,000 or higher parts per million of carbon dioxide, you're reaching like, it's kind of it's like it's noticeable. When you get to 2,000 parts per million, you start to get dizzy, lightheaded, you start to get learning loss. So we do have globally space for CO2 expansion, at least for humans.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem with increasing carbon dioxide, especially from human emissions, is that the plants might not be adapted to that in such a quick time. So plants have adapted over millions of years now at this point to be on the lower levels of carbon dioxide.
So,
But if we start increasing that, that could be detrimental, especially with the greenhouse effect.
so one of the things that Dr. Coonan was saying was that kind of almost the opposite of what you said, where he
Mhm,
said the plants, the earth would get greener
mhm.
because that's what, and then we all learned this in like middle school science or whatever, that plants breathe CO2 and
Yep.
they exhale, for lack of a better word, oxygen. So what
Mhm.
is it? Is it like an air uh like the makeup of the air, like the percentages that they wouldn't be able to, that the plants wouldn't be able to like process?
it It'd more be related to the greenhouse effect and keeping the trapped heat in the Earth's atmosphere. So
Mm-hmm.
if we have an increased greenhouse effect and it's continuously cycling over and over again, heat gets trapped. That can cause more droughts. Now the droughts are the problem. So if we have areas that are seeing record heat levels, which we have been seeing year after year after year at this point, um, in addition to the plants absorbing more CO2, we're also having other related problems, such as deforestation. We see that with the Amazon, where the Amazon is being chopped down in large areas. That people tend to call that the lungs of the earth. I don't know if you've ever
Mm-hmm.
heard that phrase.
Yeah.
There's also I I'm a little torn on that because also the Earth's oceans absorb a lot of heat. I think the Earth's oceans take in like 60% of the Earth's uh, continuous heat generation because of
Mm.
global warming, which is why the oceans are warming, and that would go up to another problem that I could talk about later, maybe. Um, but if you deforest large areas and at the same time are having large areas worth of droughts, the Earth's plant life can't keep up with that. And that's the problem that Earth's human emissions or the human emissions on the Earth causes is that we have this cycle that's been going on for millions of years, and then humans double the amount of emissions into the atmosphere, kind of breaks the cycle a little bit. So it's disjointed. I want to say it's broken, but it's disjointed. And that causes regional issues all over the globe.
Mm. Okay. That makes sense. So let me ask you this then. So if
Mhm,
humans, would you say doubled the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere the last,
mhm.
what
In
was the
parts
time
per
frame?
million.
What was the time frame?
Probably the last 200 years or so.
Okay, so that's basically the Industrial Revolution. So
Mhm.
if I was to say, okay, um, the Earth is gonna have to suck it up for another 200 years as the rest of the world goes through the Industrial Revolution, third world countries and things of that
Mhm.
nature. At at what point is it like, okay, they can go through that Industrial Revolution as, say, a China or an India becomes cleaner, right? They're a bit further along in that process than maybe countries in Africa, for example, are.
Oh yeah.
Um, as China and India become a little bit cleaner, maybe, depending on, right? We can get into there's a whole policy side to that, but let's just say
Mhm.
hypothetically they become cleaner.
Mhm.
From an atmospheric perspective, is that tolerable? I like in from a Earth's like, do you know what I'm getting at? So like
Yeah.
once the rest of the world goes through that industrial revolution part where you think of like 1800s London and it's just smog and you go outside and everybody's
Yeah.
faces are coated with like like soot and whatever else. Like after everybody
Mhm.
goes through that, because the US only produces, I think, what is it, 13%, something like that, of the world's emission or the
Yeah.
world's CO2, something like that.
We
So,
produce the majority, or in terms of amounts, the most. Like that's going back into the Industrial Revolution and everything, like time frame up.
well, I
But
mean,
yeah, at this
currently.
point, yeah.
So, I don't know. Does that question make sense? Like, is it
Yeah.
tolerable to wait? Because yeah, I don't know. Go
I
ahead.
I think it is tolerable to a point. We don't want to go. We can't really tell like countries in Africa or developing nations like you can't do this because this is
Hmm.
bad. And then we
Yeah,
look back and like look at all the factories behind us and we're like, like our bad. Sorry about that. Um, I think the way forward to solve that issue is, and the Americas doing this really good right now, is basically invest very heavily in R&D for renewable energy projects. Um, the groups such as or bills such as the Inflation Reduction Act um, really heavily invested in that part of the like tech world to finding new ways to make clean energy way cheaper and way more efficient at the same time. Um, if I think I'm going to pull out the American exceptionalism
sure.
card here. I think if America really wants to change the way that we view emissions and bring that into the rest of the world, I think we need to be leaders with that type of tech field and in that industry. If we can make it very cheap and very convenient to produce that type of electricity, groups such as China and India, they'll buy it right into that, I think,
Yeah,
because the market will be heavily favored then towards like America or the Western world. And China, I know, is investing very heavily in solar. I don't know about the other. I know they already have a lot of hydroelectric dams out there compared to America. But if we want to bring these other countries into a much like more emission-free world, we kind of have to be the leaders at this point because we've always been the leaders in whatever industrialization for the past 200 years has been going on. Um, I know that'll be an issue because people don't like to spend a lot of money on these types of things, and I get that.
yeah,
But if the way that I see it is, if we want to solve this issue, we need to be leaders here, and if we can create that kind of a future or that option for that future, I think people will follow right in line. But going back to the emissions levels, I think I think we're starting to turn a little bit of a corner here with that type of a tech and those types of emissions. Um, I don't know if you remember during COVID when we had the lockdowns,
hmm
there was like nobody on the roads for
yeah,
months, for a
none.
few months. And then I saw a few studies. There was one from India. They had a super like pollution reduction over the country. There was a point where there was I saw two pictures of two satellites. One was pre-COVID where you could see the smog
Hmm.
over the major cities, and then there was one right in the middle of COVID. There was barely any smog, and and then you can kind of replicate that across like California, where there's a lot more emissions going out because of how many people there are in like the LA area and stuff like that.
Yeah, I remember seeing
Um,
the LA ones.
yeah, so you
Yeah,
can see what happens when we can reduce emissions pretty rapidly too in the time frame of like months, like maybe several months. But if we can get to that point where we don't need to have those emissions, I think we can pretty much dodge any type of drastic curve in the Earth's like atmosphere, other types of
yeah,
emissions.
yeah. No, that makes total sense. I had a thought and I lost it. Oh yeah, of the leading into the technology, kind of the new thing makes total
Mhm.
sense, right? All the incentive, whoever develops that technology first, kind of it's a gold mine to a certain extent.
Mhm.
Um, with wind and solar specifically, though, you are dependent on weather. to a certain
Mhm.
extent for that. Um, and so I'm going to throw a couple things at you with that, but it's going to go back to the
Sure.
energy question and kind of which one becomes cheaper. So I had a nuclear engineer on some time ago.
I saw that
Um,
episode. Yeah.
yeah, and unfortunately I had was we'll say less experienced, and so Zoom kept cutting out and whatever. But I think it was still a good conversation. But in any event,
Mhm.
he was like, nuclear is cheap, is way safer now. People are scared of things like 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl,
Mhm.
etc. And so my question, first part is why is there not more investment in nuclear? Second though is with wind and solar. It is my understanding, at least to store large amounts of energy, the battery technology is not necessarily there,
Mhm.
and they would use lithium ion batteries in which to get the minerals for that, right? As I'm sure you know,
Mhm.
or some of the other minerals, cobalt, for example, is one owned. A lot of those mines are owned by China, and they're in Africa, and the it's basically slave labor.
Yeah.
Um, and so you run into this, right? You talked about environmental ethics earlier as one of the classes that you took. It runs into
Mhm.
this issue of like, okay, we need these minerals to produce the batteries to then make the next jump to really make, not that solar and wind are not sustainable at this point, but to make it effective on a like enterprise country level. Um, and so then I would say, well, why aren't we doing nuclear? And that's the part that I've never understood, because nuclear seems to like, obviously you don't want nuclear meltdowns, of course not. But if we're really going to push to this zero emissions or lower emissions, and then also produce the amount of energy that is needed, it is like, it just seems so obvious to me. So am I missing something, or like what's the situation there?
Um, so I think in terms of like wind and solar, for the
Mm-hmm.
example, I think there are a lot of projects that can produce a ton of energy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but the problem is right now is that permitting in our country sucks. And
Mm.
that's just the basic way, the blunt way of saying it is that permitting is really bad. Uh, a lot of people don't want things like solar panel farms or wind turbine farms or even nuclear specifically in their backyards. It's the whole NIMBYism problem,
Yeah. I
which
mean,
which I
I don't really
get,
blame them.
especially for
Yeah.
nuclear. Um, so it's I think one of the good examples of showcasing wind energy would be, have you heard of the Virginia offshore wind farm?
Mm-mm.
So I think it was last year, I think it finally got fully approved. There's a wind farm that's going to be off the coast of Virginia Beach in Virginia, for those listening. Um, it's going to have hundreds of wind turbines out there.
Like in the
Um,
water?
yeah, it's going to be out like a dozen miles, or I think it was like about 20 miles off the coast. Um, and it's supposed to supply 2.6 or no, 2,600 megawatts of energy, which is about 900,000 homes. So if you think about the terms of like homes, stuff like in the area, like
Mm-hmm.
regional area of how much that would just power on its own, when fully cycled up, all the energy is being produced from it, that would probably be, I think it's about the size of Northern Virginia's like DMV area, would all be powered by this one wind farm. And there are dozens of projects along the coastlines of the United States, both East and West Coast, that are just kind of stuck in limbo right now because people don't know how to do the permitting, or the permitting projects are just kind of on hold. So you have these projects that can do a lot, and they're pretty much ready to go, a lot of them. They just need to acquire the materials to build it, and then they need to pass the permitting process. And those are the two roadblocks to those right now.
Mm.
Um, I think
Interesting.
one, yeah. So I think the Virginia offshore wind farm is a really good example of that. It's taken probably about a decade to get off the ground, but when it does, feel like I'll need to go back and look at their the research documents that they had to put out the energy. It would provide more power than the nuclear reactor in Virginia, the Lake Anna nuclear reactor. I'm pretty sure.
Really
Yeah, it just
interesting.
that wind farm alone. Um, I'll need to double check that though. I'm pretty sure. But if you have all these types of projects going along the East Coast, think of all the cities that you could be powering at the same time.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
That
for
would
sure.
decrease the amount of need for the coal or natural gas, even though natural gas is, of course, not as emissions heavy as coal is. I think natural gas only puts out like 40% of the emissions that coal does, somewhere around there,
Hmm.
40 to 60%. So already, if you cut coal, natural gas is already there to kind of replace it. It's still pretty effective. But if you can kind of add in these offshore wind farms or wind farms in the United States on land out in the Midwest where most of them are, and then put up solar panels and solar farms, you'll still balance pretty much the energy needs of the citizens and have, in the case of future battery development, the ability to contain more energy and have it stored left over.
Hmm.
So with nuclear, I'm not as familiar with the nuclear side of things. I just know that a lot of people, yeah, don't like the meltdowns. So they don't want them in their backyards. Which I get. It's a safety concern. But I know they are really safe now compared to
Yeah.
what they were back in the 80s and 70s and or the early ones in the 60s.
Well,
Um,
that's what Steve was, the nuclear engineer, was saying. He was
mm,
like, all of the ones that have had meltdown, the technology was like 30, 40, 50 years old,
mhm,
and anyone that would get built now would have so many fail-safe mechanisms in place that it would be not, I'm never going to say impossible, but the likelihood
mhm,
of something like that happening, if it did happen, there would be so many things to catch it. It's like,
mhm.
so
I
yeah,
And
don't,
one
I
more
don't know.
thing. Oh,
Yeah,
one more thing. I know uh, there is a much bigger focus now on the small modular nuclear reactors.
yeah,
I know those are still in like their development phase of production, but the idea of having the small modular reactors that can regionally supply areas, and then the ability to potentially move them to supply areas that need them more. I think that's one of the things that's like mind blowing of how like revolutionary that would be for the or for the energy industry.
yeah.
Because
I remember
um
reading about those.
mhm. And then
Um,
if you can give them
Go
to other
ahead.
countries that need them as well to supply. I know there's the safety issues in terms of security about being able to move like a nuclear reactor around. That's kind of a wild idea. Is like they've always been in these giant concrete buildings with the giant silos, but if there's a way that you can have a more maneuverable one, ooh, that would be
Yeah,
crazy.
I don't know about moving them overseas. That would, the last thing I'd want is some
Exactly.
warlord to like kill all the guards and get his hands on a nuclear. It's
That's where
like
the
that's
security issue would come into
yeah,
play. Yeah.
100%. Okay, we're moving a little bit into policy.
Mhm.
I wanna kind of, not that we would close the loop on the sciencey part, but um so it seems, I guess, to say, is it fair to say that the world is not going to end in the next 50 years? Like, we're not all going to
Yeah.
die.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
So, yeah, so that's kind of, I think that's the important piece is like, okay, it's a, maybe a small to medium problem at the moment if we don't deal with it, but it's still in a stage where it's salvageable.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
100%.
I think that's I think to have that as like the takeaway. Also, none of Dom's opinions, they're all his own, not
Mhm.
of anyone else's. I don't know. I think you forgot to say that at the beginning, like we
Oh
talked
yeah.
about before. Anyways, I'll put it in the description. Just want to throw that in there. Okay,
Mhm.
so also on the policy side, you mentioned that the that wind farm would be in the water. I remember playing a game called Civilization forever ago, and one of the
I love
things
the
in
Civ
there,
games.
yeah, so you could build hydro plants in
Mhm.
those. Is that a thing? I haven't heard anyone talk about hydro energy or water energy in a while in this sort of conversation.
Mhm. Um, when it comes to hydroelectric power,
Hmm.
uh, it's not really super effective when you do the small, like dams, produce a little bit of electricity,
Hmm.
power a few homes in the area. Where you see a lot of like, then this is globally too. When you see dams that provide a lot of electricity, they're always like the Three Gorges Dam. They're these huge, giant structures that block off like some of the largest rivers in the world.
Hmm.
Um, we really I think here in the United States, we really don't have that many areas where we could do that. Um, at least to the comparable level. I've never seen any policy advocating for that.
Me neither.
It's always been solar or wind is where all the policy usually goes to. Nuclear's kind of stalled right now. But yeah, it's everybody kind of ignores it. But locally, I think you could probably do something on some of the more medium-sized rivers.
Hmm.
That's kind of just a placeholder at this point.
Yeah. What kind of
It is
impact
very
does that
effective
have,
though.
like blocking a river? Like it's like I've always had, obviously, again,
Mhm,
not having done any real research on it, it always seems kind of like a catch-22 to me. It's like, why would you want to
mhm.
block off a river? Like from like a sustainability standpoint, it's like that
Mhm.
ecosystem. Like, are you killing that ecosystem just to get a little
Mhm.
bit of electricity? Like that doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, this is where the environmental ethics would play into it. I think of trying to remember. It might have been Three Gorges over in I think that's the one in China. I know China's had a big issue because they went in on hydroelectric power
Hmm.
back in like the 90s and early 2000s. The problem that they had was because of the backup of water up to the dam, you wipe out certain amounts of like the sides of valleys
Yeah.
where the rivers are forming. They wiped out ancient like villages in areas where there would be a lot of archaeological f- like projects and stuff like that.
Ah,
So when you think
rats.
like yeah, it'd be like trying to think of an example here in the US. It'd be as if we went out west and there was a river and there were a bunch of Native American sites that are there,
Yeah.
and then we're like, okay, let's back up this river, and then it just submerges everything. So that's one of the issues that you have with that. It does kill whole ecosystems off because of that. Um, it could kill potentially farmland because there's a lot of farmland near river valley areas for irrigation. So there are a lot of issues that come out from blocking,
Well,
like putting up
that could be why nobody's talking about it then.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so let's keep with maybe the policy side a little bit.
Mhm,
As far as solutions. So we mentioned obviously everybody knows about wind and solar and nuclear and stuff.
mhm,
Um, it's interesting to me that the permitting process has become difficult or is difficult given the big push for, you would think. So then we run into, right, the big oil companies or energy companies.
mhm.
Um, we've talked a fair amount on the show before about kind of regulatory capture and that sort of thing. What is the situation to the best of your knowledge on as far as um is it similar as what we saw in other industries with the regulatory capture? What's kind of like, is it hard to get permitting because like a BP or something like that, or an Exxon is making it difficult so they can kind of get to those new technologies for, or like what's
Mhm.
really going on, right? Because who had the commercial? One of the big oil companies had the commercial about them being like the most sustainable or whatever, and then
Yeah.
but I was like, you're an oil company, so like what's going on with that?
Mhm. Um, when we talk about the different types of industries that play into like permitting processes, or I would probably say more of like the lobbying side of
Yeah.
government. Um, n- uh, I'll use the term fossil fuel. Fossil fuel companies put in a lot more money than renewable companies. So
Hmm.
they definitely have a lot more of a sway when it comes to these types of discussions. Um, and that does play into it. That is an issue. Because if you see two companies, maybe a wind farm or somebody who can pay for a property's mineral rights, and they'll pay the owner of that property for digging oil or fracking natural gas, all that stuff, will pay you money to put an oil well on your property, and then we just get the oil and stuff. Well, we'll pay you a little bit. It's kind of hard for new startup renewable energy companies to really compete with that.
Yeah.
So you'll have that issue out, especially out in the Midwest. That's a huge issue. Um, but at the same time, it does seem to be. the case that renewable energy is growing at a more rapid pace. So when it comes to the marketplace for energy, you start to see these like I don't know about specifically, but you would see companies like Exxon or BP, yeah, like those oil giants, to be like, hey, wait a minute, there might be something into this for future profit. So let's invest in a like our version of a renewable energy group, right? Whatever a
Yeah.
subsidy would be or a subsidiary would be for them. So you do start to see a little bit more renewable energy tech research in these fossil fuel companies. It is a place for them to make profit. Hey, go for it because then you can make profit and you could be a part of what seems to be like the marketplace changing already. So
Yeah.
I guess um, that's still where the divide is that there's still these two different industries that are very much at odds with each other. Um, and right now, when it comes to policy, it's kind of just it depends on what administration is in right now, to be
Yeah.
honest. You'll kind of see like this like we'll want to invest more on this side. Oh no, let's invest more on this side. And that's where the poll is right now. It's a tug of war.
It's because
But
one
yeah,
is not clearly better than the other at the moment.
mhm,
And then obviously all
it's
the
still balanced.
existing infrastructure is built off fossil fuel, oil,
Mhm,
etc.
mhm,
Um, with the renewables, wind and I meant to ask this earlier, but I just remembered the question with wind and solar and stuff. A lot of that is built on some level of technology and or electronics rather than a combustion engine or something like
mhm.
that. Um, and obviously you have the security concerns of like if a solar flare knocks out the power grid, does that mean all the solar goes down,
Mhm.
or all the wind energy goes down? Um, is that even part of the conversation? That's just something that I thought of when you were talking about it
Yeah.
before. Is that even part of the conversation at all? Or like if for example, you hear somebody say like, "Oh, Russia's got a EMP device that could knock out the power grid," or whatever the
Yeah.
case may be.
Like the satellite they just put up or
Yeah,
whatever
yeah.
the other day. um I think that's why I think those issues would be solved if we could build better batteries. I think that it pretty much comes down to the battery issue of having
Mm,
kind of at this point I wouldn't say an obsolete technology with batteries, but something that we have as a standard right now, it just needs to be better in the future. We just need to
well,
find
it's
a way
not
to store
advanced that
energy more.
much.
Mhm.
Yeah, that was one
It's
thing.
pretty simple still.
Yeah, that was one thing that I found interesting. I was listening to like forever ago, Eric Weinstein, Brett's
Mhm.
brother, on
Mhm.
Rogan's podcast, and he was saying that we haven't made a breakthrough in physics in a while, and
Mhm.
oftentimes the breakthroughs in physics is what ushers in the next great kind of technology. Because
Mhm.
aside from without that, for example, iPhones, like if you think back to the iPhone 1
Mhm.
to the iPhone now, obviously the storage is a lot better, but by and large, it's kind of the same thing on like on a grand technology scale. Like you go from flip phone to smartphone, the smartphones are still smartphones. Like there
Mhm.
hasn't been obviously you've got Siri and some of the other new features and stuff, but like on a philosophical level, I guess it's basically the same thing.
It's
Um
the same camera, it's
yeah,
the same CPU, it
and
doesn't really
there's
do
there's like
anything.
they make
Yeah.
small incremental upgrades that over the course of time make a little-ish difference.
Mhm.
Um, it feels like we're there with batteries, and until we make that next breakthrough for energy storage, no, we're gonna be stuck. Maybe is that I don't know. That's just the feeling that I get.
Yeah, we're kinda in limbo with it right
Yeah.
now. We're kinda just like, "Oh, we have all this future tech that we could use,
Hmm.
but we need those batteries. We just need that energy storage to be better." Um, I think that's why I think if you look at the policy side of things, most people that are in that sphere will be like, "Yeah, we just need to invest more. We need to get more scientists. We need." There's a lot of different like there's like it's like a tree. There's a bunch of branches to it that would improve the speed of which we could potentially hit this new technology that solves a lot of our problems or helps out at least. I think one of the problems is that we go into schools and the way that the current curriculum is set up nobody wants to be a scientist that wants to develop the new battery,
Yeah.
stuff like that. So I think if we and this is more of like the STEM field in general. When I was in
Yeah.
college, that wasn't really something that they were promoting that much. When
What
I the
wasn't
classes that I
exactly
took,
the battery
or
stuff?
or yeah, like the technology side of things. I know that would probably be more of like the engineering like aspect of that, but at the same time, you're going to need people that push that kind of policy, that kind of investment in whether it's government or in an industry.
Hmm.
And I think you're starting to see that a little bit more now, but there's it still doesn't seem that everybody's bought in yet. Which is everybody represents constituents. Sometimes they just don't care about that. You're not going to vote for it, kind of stuff like that. That makes sense from the legislation or the legislative point. Um, but at the same time, I think if you push those types of like topics more, I think you'll start to see more interest in it. And the interest drives policy, it drives production, it drives
Hmm.
all these different types of things. But right now we're just not at that level yet to where I'm not going to expect in the next year a new battery revolution to happen. But in the next decade, maybe, yeah, I'll probably think. I
I
think I
would
would think.
I would think so because you look at
Mhm,
the electric car situation, and that
mhm,
range is limited by how much electricity the battery can hold.
mhm,
Um, I'm sure you've heard people don't take their Teslas on road trips because it's
mhm.
like, where's the charging station? And so that's the other thing with kind of the electric car thing is the infrastructure is not there. I think
Yeah,
California, I think they're like, oh yeah, no more sale of non-electric cars by like 2035 or whatever. And then as soon as
yeah,
they
yeah,
had the drought, and the power was like the power grid was getting super strained, the first thing that they said was, don't charge your electric cars.
yeah.
And
You
it's
got to
like,
ration
well,
the energy now. Yeah.
yeah, so it's like, all right, man, would like which so the I think I remember reading that like they passed the policy in the spring and then in the summer they're like, don't charge your electric vehicles. And I was like,
Mhm.
oh,
Well, one of the things that also kind of blows my mind a little bit is that there are other states that will adopt that policy as their own.
mm-hmm.
So they have to follow whatever the California standard is.
Well, it's getting pushed federally, I think, or
Mhm.
at least it was at some point. I'm not sure if it got shot down. Um,
Um,
I don't
Policy
know.
related federally. I think most of these decisions are still left to the states. I think it's more of
Yeah.
like the
Well,
state.
I think there was a senator or a congressman that was like, oh, we should also do what
Oh, I'm
California's
sure.
doing.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. It's probably it's not going to happen. I don't think that's
no,
going to happen.
okay,
I
well,
think.
it just doesn't seem smart. Like
Mm,
just thinking about it for 0.2 seconds, it's like this doesn't seem like a good idea.
mm. I think it's people like to like dream to a certain level, but
Hmm.
then you have to pull them back at some point because
Yeah.
it's like if you can't achieve that, you got to bring it back here. So with the EV situation, um, there does need to be a better grid, energy grid, in order to adopt all those new like charging vehicles into it. Um, that's one of the issues that I know the renewable energy is like, can it sustain that level of like charging capacity, basically?
Yeah.
So that's another question that when you talk about energy grids and stuff, is that you got to find the balance there too.
Yeah. I wanted to run one kind of final thought or subject by you.
Mhm.
One thing I want people listening to take away is that there's so many parts to this conversation that it's so obviously we were never going to cover it all in the hour or whatever
Oh
that we were
no, no
talking.
way.
But there's so many parts to this conversation that I think is important for people to keep in mind that every part has its own motivations and limitations, whether it's the ethics side or the solutions side or or the actual climate science side or the like, because then you got atmospheric science and then the like oceanic science and some
Hmm.
those might not exactly match. So I just think it's important for people to keep that in mind. So this last thought that I wanted to get your thoughts on, I guess it kind of touches ethics policy and then also from a more right, we've talked about security a few times. Um, as we push or as people push for policy to kind of to cut down on emissions from a national perspective, at what point, where are the limitations to say like hamstringing us in terms of a production in case of a conflict type? type situation. Where are
Mhm.
people at with that? Is that a discussion that I've heard a few people, right? I'm sure you can imagine the types of people that would bring that up as a concern.
Mhm.
Um, but I've not heard it really. Is that a thing? Is that part of the discussion a lot? Like where it's just another thing to consider that I thought I heard a couple of people mention it. I didn't come up with it myself, obviously.
Yeah.
But what are your thoughts on that? Have you heard people talk about that? Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah. I guess when we think about like different regions and what type of resources they provide, there's always the issue of if this region goes into conflict, will this like cut down on our production value of some item or the export import system that we have across the world?
Or even just
Um,
us on like if we try to go to net emissions, we're not going to
mhm.
use natural gas and it cuts down on our own ability to like we have cut down on our own ability to produce by like
Oh,
a
okay.
like a zero emissions type policy where it's like, well, we
Yeah.
actually need to produce these things and we don't have enough energy from solar
Yeah.
just to throw it
I
out there
think,
currently to make that work.
yeah, I
And
got you now.
China, for example, is yeah, yeah.
Yeah. That there is definitely an issue there. I think the way that I see it right now is that I don't think we'll ever be in a position where we completely cut out one type of um, energy production system, whether it be coal, whether it be natural gas, which is it's kind of interesting. Natural gas production and coal production have pretty much flipped at this point. Um, but because natural gas is a lot easier to do like heating, which is a
Yeah.
very important thing, especially in the wintertime. Um, compared to like coal, which is pretty ineffective at
Coal is like the
production.
worst of them, right? In terms of
Yeah,
emissions and the
it's the worst
rest.
in emissions. It's the worst at energy production in general.
Yeah.
Um, for like the volume to energy kind of flow.
Hmm.
Um, but I do think we have to make sure that I think the baseline is basically everybody has enough energy to do about their daily lives. Whether it's if you have an EV, charge your car. Uh, if you have a home, heat your home. Make sure your refrigerator's running. Make sure the lights are on. I think there's a baseline. I don't think there's any reasonable point where we'll cut one of these things that supplies that out of that flow, out of that daily life flow. Um, if there is advocating for some type of removal of that, I don't really think that'll in the current world, I don't think that'll go through, I guess is to say, in
There's too
terms of
much influence from various
yeah,
entities to allow that to happen at the moment.
pretty much. I don't think anybody will bite on that. So in my the way that I view it is I'm not worried about anything like that at this point.
Hmm.
Um, it's all incremental. Everything that happens in the future here is just going to be incremental change. And that's just the way the way the policy world works. It's the way the production. That's the way the industries work. I don't expect it to change that much anytime soon.
Okay, fair enough. If you had to summarize your like all the readings and thoughts and things that you've done, I think there was some study, I don't remember what the exact, there's some large percentage of like teenagers or high school people think the world is ending in 10 years or
Yeah.
whatever. Um, and then obviously you got people that are like climate change is a hoax. It's like, all right, well, that's not
Hmm.
good either. But if you had to summarize or give like a bottom line takeaway for those listening into the situation, what would that be? In
Um.
your opinion, of course.
Yeah. I think. Uh. I think the takeaway for a lot of the climate change, and energy transition, these topics, I think the way that we should view it now is that yes, the climate is changing. Yes, it's going to get hotter. That could lead to issues in the future relating to food insecurity, energy infrastructure problems. But if people want to change that, if people want to help the world adapt to those problems, get involved in these types of conversations and get involved in these industries. If you really want to uh, make nuclear power the way that the world turns to save the energy transition problem, become a nuclear physicist, become a nuclear engineer. If that's something that you really want to get involved in, start studying those types of things. Start looking up the way, like the information on them, so you have an understanding. Or if you want to get into those positions, go right ahead. I think that's a great thing. The more the merrier at this point. And that's involved in all these types of industries that we discussed in the podcast today.
Yeah, you just told people to go become a nuclear physicist.
Go become a
It's
new.
like,
If you, I think when we find problems, I think the best way to go about it is that people get informed, and then people make decisions based on that information. And being trapped in these little bubbles where you don't want to leave and you don't want to become a part of the change, I think is a problem. That's why I do what I do, is because I think I'm solving problems, and that's where my passion for my work comes from. So I hope everybody finds that passion to do something. And if it's the complexities of climate change are crazy, and the way that policy is, it's boring, it's policy, but some people might find it interesting. And I hope those people go and find something that they can change, you know?
fair enough.
So,
Fair enough. See, it's not all doom and gloom, guys, unlike
not.
Tottenham.
yeah, no, yeah. It's bad,
um,
man.
we should, okay, so I feel like if we were going to get into another subject, we'd be here for forever. So I
Oh,
think
yeah.
this is a good
It's all
place to
good.
end. Do you have any, well, I guess you just kind of summarized it last, but I was going to say, if you have any last nickels, feel free to share. Do you?
Yeah, I think
Okay,
that covers
very nice.
everything.
For those listening, if you have any questions, of course, hit me up and I can get the questions to Dom if you're curious about anything.
Yeah,
Or if I don't know, I'm putting you on the spot. If Dom, if you want to come back on and we can maybe get some questions from people and kind
sure.
of discuss those at some point. Feel free to send those over. And yeah, we'll see you guys next time. Peace.